At this point in human history, even if you are below the poverty line, you are essentially living the life of a king. You can buy an incredible amount of junk you don't need. You can watch, in effect, every movie that Hollywood has ever produced on demand. With only a few dollars in your pocket, you can buy hundreds, thousands of calories at a local grocery store or even at a gas station. And yet, everyone is unhappy. Why is that? I think it has to do with the fact that there was a mid-century American economic and geopolitical situation that became defined as the American dream. That is, you have a good job in a factory, maybe at a corporation, something like that, and you work it for a few decades. You have a pension, a retirement, if you're a little bit wealthier, gold watch, and a slap on the back. The reality is that type of American dream came from somewhere. It had a political origin that we need to think through. To the degree that Trump's tariffs are popular at all, and I'm not sure they're going to be outside of his base of supporters, they are calling upon that mid-20th century American dream. The problem is that the Chinese, their labor is too cheap, and ditto for a whole host of countries in Asia and South America and beyond. We've just got to tariff the hell out of them so that there's an even playing field. There is so much tax on an imported product that you might as well produce it in the United States with all of our healthcare and education and cost of living requirements built into it. And we could go back. We could return to the 20th century. So over the past 75 to 80 years, we have gone from a manufacturing economy that made up 75% of employment to a post-industrial, post-manufacturing service economy in which manufacturing is now slightly less than 10% of employment. And let's be honest, particularly over the last 10 years, we've emerged as a kind of bullshit economy. I mean, there are people who make money on drop shipping t-shirts, people who make a living selling and trading and promoting meme coins, et cetera, et cetera. It has gotten very post-industrial and, in fact, postmodern. Within that, there is still a fantasy of returning to the 1950s. Maybe not culturally exactly, although there is that fantasy, but returning to the 1950s economically. You are an employee, you have a good wage, you have 2.3 children, 1.7 cars, 3 television sets, a house. You take a 2-week vacation every year, and you retire in glory. Now, as I mentioned, that type of American dream had an origin. And that origin was the Second World War. There is no question that the United States is blessed with a tremendous amount of natural resources, a huge advantage, isolated from Europe and Asia by oceans, amazing waterways, etc. But one of the key competitive advantages for American labor was the fact that Europe was in rubble. Europe had just gone through the Second World War, and it was going to take quite a bit for them to get back up to speed. Now, another massive advantage was monetary policy. That is something that we rarely think about. And here I'm referring to the Bretton Woods Accords and the things that came after it. So before the war ended in 1944, there was a conference in Bretton Woods, the United States, and there was the establishment of the dollar system. That is, the dollar would be a reserve currency for the world, or at least the favored parts of the world, those blessed to not be living in communism and blessed to have good relations with Washington, D.C. Everything would be traded in dollars. The dollar would be tied to gold in Fort Knox. Thus, there was a sort of stability to the dollar itself. Gold is a precious metal that has been valued forever, at least since the Stone Age. And you could fix your currency to the dollar, deal with Washington in a reasonable fashion, maybe even if you're a European country, join NATO and be in a military alliance alongside Washington, but at least not be an enemy of Uncle Sam. You could take advantage of this system. I do think that the system was motivated by getting rich to some extent, but I don't think it should always be thought of in those terms. It was a political system. It was about maintaining peace, but also maintaining American hegemony, that is Pax Americana. Now, during the Nixon administration in the early 70s, this Bretton Woods system began to break down, although not completely. So during the New Deal era, FDR refused to honor gold certificates, and there was a gold confiscation. So in effect, the United States went off the gold standard internally, more or less. There's still obviously a huge reserve in Fort Knox. In 1971, Richard Nixon took the world off the gold standard. He refused to honor exchanges of dollars for gold, so it's called closing the gold window, and it created a massive shock around the world. Currencies could then start free floating. They could be exchanged for one another, and there was the creation of this massive foreign exchange market that exists today. Now, oil was largely sold in dollars, and so we have the concept of the petrodollar. So as opposed to yellow gold, we have black gold. If you need to buy oil and power an industrial economy, you are going to use dollars. There's just this built-in power of the US dollar. If you could think of it this way, if you're buying an American product, you're paying for it in dollars. So in effect, you're purchasing dollars. There's a demand for dollars. Now, I think the rollout of Trump's tariff proposal has been confusing, preposterous, absurd, unnecessarily alienating to allies, and the whole kit and caboodle. He is launching global tariffs. He is explaining the reasoning behind these tariffs in utterly fraudulent, ridiculous ways, creating these formulas that simply make no sense. He is claiming that the allies are ripping us off. Even if that is true, and I don't think it's true, as you can tell from what I said before, it's probably not the best thing to say. You could maybe say that about China yelling at Canada for ripping off Americans. A bit uncouth and unnecessary. But it all gets back to a fantasy that is not only Trump's. It's shared by a whole host of thinkers for decades, paleo-liberals and paleo-conservatives alike. Pat Buchanan and Paul Tsongas, a now forgotten presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, made in America, sold to the world. He said, "I can't believe it. Look who won the Cold War. It wasn't the USSR America. It was Germany and Japan. The Axis powers won the Cold War." How did that happen? Yes, it happened because they invested in their manufacturing base. They engaged in a sort of conspiracy of labor, government, and corporations to make high quality products in Germany and Japan and sell them to the world. They won, we lost, our manufacturing was hollowed out. This is a big fantasy shared by millions of people, thousands of pundits and politicians and writers, etc. I don't really blame them for having this fantasy. There is something highly attractive about the idea of manufacturing high-quality goods, selling them to the world, the label Made in America being meaningful, etc. I get it. I see a lot of these fantasies among the left. I see these fantasies among the right. And it's not necessarily just a fantasy. High-quality manufacturing is still possible in the United States. However, there are much better ways of recreating such an atmosphere than what Donald Trump is doing. Manufacturing can't just come back, as many people say. We need to remember that the iPhone has never been made in the United States. The iPhone has only been made in a situation of China being a member of the World Trade Organization, of the Chimerica relationship that is designed in California, made in China, sold in America, financed by China, purchasing debt, et cetera, that weird circular arrangement. That is the only way that the iPhone has ever been created. Now, could it be created in other ways? Sure, quite possibly, but it never has been. I don't think it would be impossible to create a product like the iPhone in the United States, but the amount of investment that that would entail is going to be a generational project. It would involve robotics. It would involve onshoring manufacturing know-how. It would involve a conspiracy between corporations, government, and labor to create that sort of high-skilled force that would even be capable of producing that. There's a lot of crap made in China, filled with sawdust, with cut corners, etc., but obviously Chinese manufacturing is capable of high-quality goods if they put their mind to it. Recreating something like that, or at least creating a situation that could produce a product like that in the United States, is going to be tremendously difficult. And if Trump were to promote something like that, and it seems like a quite laudable goal, the idea of shocking the world, shocking his donors, shocking the business community with these tariffs does not seem to be a good way of doing it. There would have to be tremendous amount of subsidies, tax breaks, investment, re-education, etc., for something like that to even be possible. And I don't see any of those things. What I see from Trump is the mentality of a real estate mogul, which makes a lot of sense, I guess. You've got to pay up if you want to sell your products here. We've got the biggest, greatest economy in the world. You have to pay an admission fee or rent or a resort fee or something like that to even participate in this market. I get the mentality, but I think this is going to create a disaster. Another aspect of Trump, and something that we could use to explain this failure, is just pure narcissism. He wants countries coming to him, in his words, kissing his ass, begging for tariffs to be lifted, pleading with him for a break. Let's make a deal. I'm the greatest negotiator. I'll get it done. Everything is centralized through the president. This is a kingly attitude, very interesting, certainly fitting with Trump's personality. Again, to reorient the global economy in this way, this fast, does seem rather absurd, and I could imagine this becoming a complete disaster. So a lot of indicators that it already is a disaster. We've had some stock market problems, but those problems are not cliff-like problems. The stock market hasn't fallen off a cliff where we've gone back a decade in valuation. It's not the equivalent of the fall of 2008 or 1987 or 1929. It's not that bad, although those things do usually happen in the fall due to human psychology, and we'll see what happens in September and October 2025. Secondly, the bond rates of the Treasury bills are actually increasing. They're higher than they've been in quite some time. That indicates that people are not selling stocks and diving into treasuries, which is what always happens. Actually, in 2008, the Treasury yield, I think it was like a 10-year yield, went negative or some crazy thing like that. In the sense, people were seeking a safe haven with such desperation that they were paying the Treasury to hold their money. It's absurd in many ways. Now, the fact that that is not happening, that we're getting a falling stock market and increasing rates of treasuries, it's very early, but it seems to indicate a kind of stagflation. That is, the outlook for the future is bleak, things are declining, and yet we're having inflation. Money is worth less. A treasury bill, they have to give you more and more interest for you to hold it. It is a very bad sign, although I would say it's very early and those things can change rather quickly. I recently watched a video by Money and Macro, and this person actually looked into Scott Bessent, who's the Treasury Secretary, and he looked into his writings, and he seemed to try to draw out a kind of theory of what's happening. The Occam's razor would lead us to believe that Trump is simply being narcissistic. He wants to be the king. He's simply acting like a real estate mogul, pay a fee to get in. Those are the simplest explanations for what is happening. A more interesting explanation is that Trump really is totally reorienting global trade. And he's going to do it in a way where he can have his cake and eat it too, in effect. So we're not going back to the gold standard. That is far off. Maybe we'll end up there at some point, but we're not going back to the gold standard anytime soon. We might actually go back to a situation in which favored nations have a fixed exchange rate to the dollar. The theory of this is that Donald Trump, as I said, can have his cake and eat it too. The dollar is going to be weakened. That means that American products, such as they are, to the extent that they still exist, will be more attractive in the sense that it'll simply be cheaper. A weaker dollar means less expensive products, more attractive to the rest of the world. At the same time, the amazing benefit, the geopolitical benefit of the dollar as a reserve currency will be maintained through this favored nation, you could say, fixed exchange rate. Very interesting idea. It's a kind of Bretton Woods 2.0. It's actually closer to the original Bretton Woods system than it is to the Nixonian free-floating currency system. Very interesting. I will believe that this is true if Trump starts backing down on all of these tariffs to friendly nations. If he says, hey, Canada, I know I've said some harsh things in the past, but let's make a deal here. We're already aligned geopolitically. We have a long history together. Some people say we should be the same country. Why don't we just have a zero tariff regime between our two nations? We can fix the currencies, etc. If he does that with Western Europe, as Elon Musk proposed. Elon Musk does not like tariffs and was saying there should be a free movement of capital and labor even between the United States and the European Union. If Trump backs down on those countries, very friendly NATO-aligned countries, then I could actually believe that something like that is happening, that we're going to create a goldless, though fixed exchange rate that is more attractive, that is more beneficial to the United States. I'm not sure I see anything like that happening. What I am seeing is absolute hostility towards every nation, including our allies. I don't see Western Europe. I mean, Western Europe is certainly desperate at this point, but I don't think that they want to get into some sort of fixed exchange rate community with the United States. Now, another aspect of this is China, of course. And in some ways, it's the, elephant in the room or the dragon in the room in this context. Donald Trump could really be totally unwinding the Chimerica relationship that has lasted since 1972 and Nixon's outreach to China. It's certainly been around in the 90s, but it really took hold in 2001 when China entered the World Trade Organization. Designed in California, made in China, sold in Walmart. This would indicate extreme hostility towards China. China is always listed as number one on the U.S. strategic assessments every year, above Russia as a real adversary towards the United States. Are we at a point where this quarter century, actually even longer, rapprochement, frenemy relationship with China is simply ending? During the Cold War, the United States had, I guess you could say, more economic relations with the Soviet Union than you would have imagined. There was the entrance of McDonald's and Coke and Pepsi in the 1980s. There were commodity investment and exchanges throughout the Cold War. But we certainly didn't have anything as closely tied together as Chimerica between the Soviet Union. Are we now going to get, in effect, on a war footing with China? And if that is the case, why is Trump doing this so abruptly that he is going to seriously damage all of these corporations that cannot operate for the next 10 years at least outside of the Chimerica relationship? It's a lot of questions.